8 years of loyalty disappeared with a single sentence. She smiled, congratulated the CEO's daughter on her promotion, and quietly placed her resignation on the conference table, never mentioning that by sunrise, a $31 million deal would be frozen by one signature only she could provide. The conference room overlooked the city like a polished glass balcony, its floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting towers of steel and morning sunlight. Inside, the atmosphere felt unusually tense. Coffee cups sat untouched beside open laptops displaying financial reports that no one was actually reading. The CEO had called an unexpected company-wide meeting, and quiet speculation drifted through the room. Emma took her usual seat near the center of the table, exactly where she had worked through hundreds of strategy sessions over the past 8 years. During those years, she had become the person everyone depended on, the one who arrived before sunrise, stayed long after sunset, rescued impossible projects, and quietly solved problems before they ever reached senior management. Almost everyone in the room assumed today's announcement would finally recognize those years of loyalty. Nobody said her name aloud, but they didn't have to. Department heads exchanged confident smiles, and even employees from other divisions glanced toward Emma as if the outcome had already been decided. She never chased attention, yet her reputation had been built project after project, client after client, until she had become the company's unofficial problem solver. The conference room fell silent as CEO Richard Lawson entered, followed by his daughter Olivia. Richard carried the relaxed confidence of a man who expected every decision to be accepted without question. Olivia looked polished and professional, though there was still something unmistakably new about her presence. Emma greeted her with a polite nod, receiving an equally polite smile in return. Richard stepped to the front of the room and thanked everyone for another successful year. Revenue had exceeded expectations, investor confidence was stronger than ever, and the company was preparing for its next phase of growth. Then he paused, smiled proudly, and announced, "After careful consideration, I've decided to appoint our new operations director. I'm giving the promotion to my daughter, Olivia." The silence that followed was heavier than any applause could have been. Someone accidentally dropped a pen, and the sound echoed across the room. Several executives immediately lowered their eyes, while others exchanged uncomfortable glances they couldn't quite hide. Everyone understood what had just happened. 8 years of loyalty had just lost to one last name. Richard continued speaking about fresh perspectives and new leadership, as though the decision required no explanation. Olivia thanked everyone for their confidence, trying to sound humble, but the atmosphere had already changed. Emma wasn't angry. The disappointment settled into something much quieter, a clear understanding that merit had never been the deciding factor after all. When Richard finally addressed her directly, he offered the kind of carefully chosen corporate sympathy that often hurts more than honesty. "I know this may be disappointing," he said. "We truly value everything you've contributed to this company." Emma held his gaze for a moment before allowing herself a small smile. She remembered the weekends she had sacrificed, the vacations she had postponed, the endless late nights spent protecting deals that ultimately made the company millions. She remembered every promise that hard work would always be rewarded. Without saying a word, she opened her portfolio, removed a sealed envelope, and placed it gently on the conference table. "My resignation," she said calmly. Richard stared at the envelope, visibly caught off guard. "Your resignation?" "My notice is effective immediately under the terms of my executive agreement." He forced an uneasy laugh and tried to recover. "Emma, let's not make emotional decisions." "This isn't emotional," she replied. "I prepared it last night." For the first time since entering the room, the CEO's confidence faltered. He looked at the letter, then back at Emma, as though trying to understand how control had slipped away so quickly. "You don't have to do this," I know. She closed her laptop, picked up her bag, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she stopped just long enough to congratulate Olivia sincerely. Then she looked back at Richard one final time. Loyalty only has value when both sides honor it. The door closed quietly behind her. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontation. Only silence remained in the conference room as executives looked from the resignation letter to one another, suddenly realizing that something far more important than a promotion had just walked out of the building. Emma stepped into the elevator, feeling lighter than she had in years. Just as the doors began to close, her phone vibrated. The screen displayed 3 simple words: lead investor calling. Emma let the elevator carry her down in complete silence. The familiar hum of the cables seemed louder than usual, filling the empty space where anxiety should have been. Strangely, she didn't feel panicked. She felt relieved. For 8 years, she had measured her worth by deadlines, investor meetings, and impossible expectations. The building that had once represented ambition now looked like nothing more than polished glass wrapped around fragile egos. As the lobby doors slid open, her phone vibrated again. The caller ID confirmed what she had already seen upstairs. Daniel Brooks, lead investor. She answered before the second ring. Emma, Daniel said without wasting a second on greetings. I just received the final version of the acquisition package. Congratulations must be in order. I heard there was a leadership announcement this morning. Emma smiled faintly. There was. I assume that means you'll be signing this afternoon? She paused just long enough for him to notice. No, she replied calmly. I resigned about 15 minutes ago. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. I'm sorry, you resigned? Effective immediately. Daniel's voice changed completely. The casual confidence disappeared, replaced by the careful tone of someone reviewing unexpected numbers on a balance sheet. Emma, I think there's something I need to verify. Stay by your phone. I wasn't planning to go anywhere. The call ended and Emma slipped her phone into her coat pocket before walking toward the parking garage. She wasn't trying to create a crisis. She wasn't trying to punish anyone. She had simply chosen not to remain where loyalty had become optional. Whatever happened next would happen because of agreements that had existed long before that morning's meeting. Upstairs, celebration had already begun. Balloons appeared outside Olivia's new office. Assistants hurried through the hallway carrying flowers, and the communications department drafted an internal announcement celebrating the company's next generation of leadership. Richard Lawson accepted congratulations with the relaxed smile of a man convinced he had managed another successful transition. Then his executive assistant entered without knocking. Mr. Lawson, Daniel Brooks is requesting an immediate video conference. Richard glanced at the clock. Already? Tell him I'll call this afternoon. He specifically said it cannot wait. The confidence on Richard's face faded only slightly. Fine, 5 minutes. The boardroom monitor lit up moments later. Daniel appeared on screen without his usual small talk. Richard, I have one question before we proceed. Of course. Where's Emma? Richard leaned back comfortably. She decided to move on this morning. Unfortunate timing, but we've already appointed a replacement. Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he opened a digital copy of the acquisition documents. I've been reviewing the execution requirements. Richard smiled. Our legal department has everything under control. I don't believe they do. Daniel enlarged one specific page. The investment agreement identifies Emma Carter as the designated operational certifying officer. Richard frowned. That's just a title. No. Daniel adjusted his glasses. It's a contractual designation negotiated during due diligence 18 months ago. For the first time that morning, Richard stopped smiling. Our new operations director can sign. Daniel slowly shook his head. Not under this agreement. Richard reached for the printed contract lying on the table. There must be another authorization clause. There is. He turned another page. It requires unanimous written approval from every participating investment group before the designated certifying officer can be replaced. Richard flipped through the document faster. Page after page, signature blocks, appendices, legal schedules. None of them said what he wanted them to say. Daniel continued in the same measured voice. The reason was simple. During negotiations, every major investor insisted on operational continuity. Emma personally presented every integration model, every compliance forecast, every financial risk assessment. Our legal teams tied final operational certification to the executive who built those systems. Richard looked toward the company's general counsel, who had quietly entered the room during the call. The attorney's expression answered the question before he spoke. I need to review the language. Daniel sighed. I already have. The room became noticeably quieter. What exactly are you saying? Richard asked. I'm saying the $31 million investment cannot close today. Richard straightened in his chair. We'll appoint someone else. Eventually. We'll amend the agreement. Eventually. We'll call the investors. Daniel nodded once. You can certainly try. Richard's fingers tightened around the edge of the conference table. This is becoming unnecessarily complicated. No, Daniel replied. It's becoming contract law. No one in the room spoke. The attorney continued reading, turning pages more slowly now, as if hoping the wording might somehow change. It didn't. Richard suddenly remembered every board presentation Emma had prepared, every negotiation she had quietly led, every document he had signed after trusting someone else's expertise. He had assumed operational details were interchangeable. Now, those very details were sitting inside a legally binding agreement bearing dozens of signatures, including his own. The celebration outside the boardroom continued for another minute before someone quietly removed the balloons. Inside, nobody noticed. Daniel finally broke the silence. I recommend informing your board of directors immediately. They're going to hear about this from us regardless. The call ended. For several long seconds, no one moved. Richard slowly closed the contract, but the weight in the room remained. For the first time that day, it became painfully clear that replacing a title had been easy. Replacing the person behind it might be impossible. And the board still had no idea what had just landed on its desk. If you've ever seen hard work overlooked while connections got rewarded, share your story in the comments. And if you enjoy stories where patience and integrity speak louder than revenge, don't forget to subscribe. The emergency board meeting was scheduled less than an hour later. By then, the atmosphere inside Lawson Strategic Partners had transformed completely. The excitement that had filled the hallways earlier that morning had disappeared, replaced by hushed conversations that stopped the moment a senior executive walked by. News traveled quickly in corporate offices, especially when nobody officially confirmed it. Employees knew only fragments. Emma had resigned, the lead investor had requested an emergency meeting, and the board had been called in without notice. Those fragments were enough to make everyone uneasy. Richard Lawson stood alone in his office, staring through the glass wall overlooking the city. For years he had believed he understood every moving piece inside his company. He had built the business from a small consulting firm into a respected national organization. His instincts had rarely failed him. Yet this morning something felt different. It wasn't simply that an experienced executive had resigned. Good people left companies every day. It was the realization that he had signed a legally binding agreement without fully appreciating why one specific clause had been included. His general counsel entered carrying a thick binder filled with contracts, compliance notes, and due diligence records. I've gone through everything twice, the attorney said, placing the binder on the desk. Daniel Brooks wasn't exaggerating. Richard looked up. Tell me there's another interpretation. There isn't. There has to be. There really doesn't. The attorney opened the binder to a bookmarked page. During negotiations, the investors insisted that operational certification remain with the executive who designed the integration framework. At the time, everyone agreed that executive was Emma. The clause wasn't about her job title. It was about continuity and accountability. Richard rubbed his forehead. Nobody told me this would become an issue. You approved it. I approved hundreds of pages. And that's exactly why investors requested the clause. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence carried more weight than another legal explanation ever could. Meanwhile, Emma was sitting in a quiet corner of a neighborhood cafe several miles away. She had traded polished conference rooms for a wooden table beside a rain-speckled window. The coffee tasted better than anything she had ever hurried through between meetings. Around her, strangers carried on ordinary conversations without the slightest idea that a multi-million-dollar acquisition had unexpectedly stalled. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't watching the news or checking social media. She simply opened a notebook and began writing a list titled, "Things I Never Had Time For." The list started with simple entries. Take a weekend without answering emails. Call mom before work instead of after midnight. Finish the novel sitting on the bedside table. Sleep. For the first time in years, none of those goals felt impossible. Her phone buzzed several times on the table. Messages from former coworkers appeared one after another. Are you okay? Nobody saw this coming. The office feels completely different. She appreciated every message, but answered only a few. She had no desire to turn herself into the center of office gossip. Whatever was happening back at headquarters belonged to the company now, not to her. Back in the boardroom, the directors gathered around the long conference table. Some had traveled across the city with almost no explanation beyond the words, "urgent legal matter." Richard summarized the morning's events as carefully as he could, omitting none of the essential facts. When he finished, the room remained silent for several seconds. Finally, one board member leaned forward. "Let me make sure I understand. We promoted your daughter this morning. Emma resigned immediately afterward. And now our largest investment cannot close because the agreement requires her operational certification." Richard nodded once. "That's correct." Another director adjusted his glasses. "Was anyone aware of this clause before today?" The general counsel answered honestly. It was documented during negotiations. But no contingency plan was prepared? No. The answer landed harder than anyone expected. A third director, usually the quietest person in the room, folded his hands together. "Then our problem isn't Emma." Several heads turned toward him. "Our problem is governance." Nobody argued. The words settled over the room with uncomfortable precision. This was no longer about one promotion or one resignation. It had become a question of leadership, oversight, and decision-making at the highest level of the company. Richard glanced toward the empty chair where Emma had often presented quarterly operational reports. Only now did he notice how many of the company's biggest successes had quietly carried her fingerprints. She had never demanded recognition. She had simply delivered results, allowing everyone else to take confidence in systems she had built. The board spent the next hour discussing legal options. Amendments were possible, but not immediate. Temporary certifications required unanimous investor approval. Renegotiating the agreement could take weeks. Every solution carried delays, additional reviews, and significant costs. Eventually, one director asked the question nobody else wanted to voice. "Has anyone actually spoken with Emma?" Richard hesitated. "No." "Why not?" "I assumed she needed space." The director looked at him calmly. "Or perhaps you assumed she'd come back." Richard offered no answer, because he wasn't certain anymore. Outside, the afternoon sunlight reflected across the company's glass facade exactly as it had that morning. From the street, nothing looked different. Employees still entered through revolving doors, deliveries still arrived, meetings still appeared on calendars. But inside those walls, everyone now understood something they hadn't understood a few hours earlier. Replacing a position on an organizational chart took only minutes. Replacing trust built over 8 years was an entirely different matter. The following morning, the office felt quieter than anyone could remember. Conversations were shorter, laughter had disappeared, and even the usual rush of keyboards seemed subdued. Emma's desk had been cleared overnight, but the empty space somehow drew more attention than when it had been occupied. Employees slowed down as they walked past it, as if expecting her to appear, carrying a coffee, and asking whether the latest client issue had been resolved. Instead, there was only silence. Olivia arrived early, determined to prove she deserved the title she had been given. She had spent the previous evening reviewing reports, organizational charts, and project timelines. She wasn't lazy, nor was she arrogant enough to believe the job would be easy. What unsettled her was discovering just how much of the company's daily operation depended on knowledge that had never been written down. Every few minutes, someone knocked on her office door. Emma usually handled this. Do you know where Emma kept the integration schedule? Which approval process are we supposed to follow for the investor reports? Has anyone seen the compliance checklist Emma updated every Friday? The questions kept coming, and Olivia answered each one as honestly as she could. I don't know yet. By lunchtime, she had filled several pages with notes, yet she felt as though she understood less than when the day had begun. The company wasn't falling apart because Emma had hidden information. Quite the opposite. Emma had spent years making complicated systems look effortless, and that very success had created the illusion that anyone could simply step into her role. Richard watched the confusion spread across the executive floor with growing concern. For years, he had mistaken stability for simplicity. He was beginning to understand that stability had a name, and that name had walked out of the building with a resignation letter tucked neatly inside a leather portfolio. He asked the Human Resources Director to prepare a complete transition file. An hour later, she returned carrying a single folder. This is everything we have. Richard opened it. Performance reviews, promotion recommendations, training records, leadership evaluations. Every annual review described Emma with nearly identical language. Exceptional judgment, trusted by clients, indispensable during negotiations, consistently exceeds expectations. Attached to the final review was a recommendation submitted almost a year earlier. Recommended for immediate promotion to Operations Director. The recommendation had been approved by every executive who evaluated her. Every executive except one. Richard slowly closed the folder. He remembered postponing the promotion twice, each time convincing himself there would be a better opportunity later. There had always been another quarter to finish, another acquisition to close, another board presentation to prepare. Emma never complained, and because she never complained, he assumed she would always stay. That assumption now looked painfully expensive. Later that afternoon, Daniel Brooks arrived in person instead of scheduling another video conference. The lead investor greeted everyone politely, but skipped the usual small talk. He had worked with enough companies to recognize when a crisis was being managed and when it was merely being delayed. Richard invited him into the boardroom. I appreciate you coming. I thought this conversation deserved to happen face to face. Richard nodded. We're exploring every available option. I'm sure you are. Daniel placed a copy of the investment agreement on the table. I want to make one thing perfectly clear. Our investment group is not trying to create leverage, embarrass the company, or interfere with your leadership decisions. Then what are you saying? I'm saying we invested in systems we believed were reliable. He tapped the agreement gently. During due diligence, Emma answered every difficult question we asked. She never exaggerated, never overpromised, and never shifted responsibility. When we challenged her projections, she returned the next morning with supporting data instead of excuses. That's rare. Richard listened without interrupting. Daniel continued. Our confidence wasn't based on a logo or a building. It was based on people who demonstrated competence over time. The words weren't hostile. That somehow made them harder to hear. So what happens now? Richard finally asked. Daniel leaned back. That depends entirely on your board. Richard frowned. You mean whether they'll approve contract amendments? No, Daniel held his gaze. I mean whether they'll honestly evaluate how this situation happened in the first place. The room fell quiet again. Daniel wasn't demanding Emma's return. He wasn't threatening lawsuits or penalties. He was pointing towards something much larger than one delayed investment. Trust. Once damaged, it rarely returned because someone asked politely. After Daniel left, Richard remained alone in the boardroom. Through the glass walls, he could see employees moving from meeting to meeting, carrying laptops and folders exactly as they had every other day. Yet the atmosphere had changed in a way no quarterly report could measure. He walked past Emma's former office on his way back upstairs. The lights were off. The shelves were empty. Only a small green plant remained on the windowsill, forgotten during the hurried departure. Its leaves leaned toward the afternoon sunlight, continuing to grow without asking anyone's permission. Richard stood there for a long moment before quietly asking his assistant to leave the office exactly as it was. Should we prepare it for someone else? She asked. He looked once more through the open doorway. Not yet. For the first time since the promotion announcement, he stopped thinking about replacing an employee. Instead, he found himself wondering whether the company had spent 8 years overlooking the very person who had been holding it together all along. 3 days later, the company's headquarters looked as polished as ever, but appearances had become increasingly difficult to trust. Clients still arrived for meetings, receptionists still greeted visitors with practiced smiles, and conference rooms remained fully booked. Beneath that routine, however, every department was working around delays that no one wanted to discuss openly. Reports took longer to approve. Investor questions lingered unanswered. Small decisions that once moved in minutes now waited for signatures, reviews, and second opinions. The board had spent those 3 days examining far more than the stalled $31 million agreement. They reviewed promotion records, governance procedures, executive approvals, and internal recommendations. What began as an emergency meeting had quietly evolved into a comprehensive review of how major leadership decisions had been made over the past several years. The findings were uncomfortable. Again and again, Emma's name appeared beside successful initiatives, operational improvements, and investor praise. Again and again, formal recommendations described her as the natural successor for senior leadership. None of those recommendations had been challenged on merit. They had simply never reached their logical conclusion. One director closed the final report and looked around the table. This isn't a legal failure, another nodded. It's a leadership failure. No one disagreed. Richard listened without attempting to defend himself. For perhaps the first time in his career, he wasn't searching for a convincing explanation. Every argument he considered sounded smaller than the facts sitting in front of him. The promotion had not been questioned because Olivia lacked potential. It had been questioned because the process had ignored every principle the company claimed to value. When the meeting ended, the board voted unanimously to establish an independent governance committee to review executive appointment procedures. Future promotions to senior leadership would require documented evaluations, board oversight, and transparent approval standards. The decision would not change what had already happened. but it would ensure that it could not happen the same way again. Richard signed the resolution without hesitation. Later that afternoon, he asked his assistant for Emma's personal phone number. She looked mildly surprised. "I thought you already had it." "I do," Richard admitted quietly. "I just haven't known what to say." The assistant gave a sympathetic smile. "Sometimes there isn't a perfect sentence." Richard waited until evening before making the call. Emma answered after a few rings. "Hello? It's Richard." "I know." There was no hostility in her voice, only calm. "I won't take much of your time," he said. "I wanted to tell you that the board completed its review today. I hope it was productive." "It was enlightening." Neither of them spoke for a moment. Finally, Richard continued. "I owe you an apology." Emma listened without interrupting. "I convinced myself that loyalty could wait because you never demanded recognition. I confused your professionalism with permanence. Looking back, I realize I spent years rewarding availability instead of contribution." His voice carried none of the confidence that had filled the conference room only days earlier. "I was wrong." Emma looked out the window of her apartment. The evening sky had turned shades of gold and deep blue, and children were laughing in a nearby park. It struck her how different ordinary life sounded when it wasn't interrupted every few minutes by incoming emails. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "I know an apology doesn't undo anything." "No," she said gently, "but acknowledging the truth is still worth something." Richard hesitated before asking the question that had occupied his thoughts since she left. "Would you consider coming back?" Emma smiled to herself. Months earlier, she would have answered before he finished the sentence. She loved the company. She believed in its mission. She had invested nearly a decade of her life there. But something fundamental had changed. "I appreciate the offer," she said. "I truly do." Another pause. "But I resigned because I finally understood my value. I don't think I should have to lose it before it's recognized." Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment. "I understand." "And for what it's worth," Emma continued, "I hope the company succeeds." "You do?" "Of course. Most of the people there are good people. They deserve good leadership." The conversation ended with mutual respect rather than resentment. No threats, no negotiations, no dramatic final exchange. Just two professionals acknowledging a truth that had arrived later than it should have. A week afterward, the investors and the board finalized a revised agreement through the proper legal process. It required additional reviews, independent approvals, and unanimous consent from every investment group. The acquisition eventually moved forward, though not on the original timeline. The delay cost the company money, credibility, and countless hours of additional work. But it also forced changes that many directors privately admitted were overdue. Emma watched none of it unfold from inside the company. She accepted a leadership position elsewhere, joining an organization that had approached her not because of a famous surname or office politics, but because of her record. During her first meeting, the chairman welcomed her with a simple sentence. "We hired the person who built the results, not the person who inherited the title." It wasn't louder than the applause she never received. It was simply more meaningful. Months later, one of Emma's former colleagues sent her a short message. "Things are different now. Promotions are transparent. The board asks harder questions. People feel like their work actually matters." Emma read the message twice before placing her phone on the table. She smiled, not because anyone had lost, but because something had finally been corrected. In the end, her greatest victory wasn't a courtroom decision, a public confrontation, or a dramatic act of revenge. It was walking away with her integrity intact.